Welcome back, Cold Warriors, for another installation of The Bearded Wonder and History. And today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War, another one of our kind of hot war kind of situations that takes place during the Cold War, basically, and a war on an idea. That idea is communism. So, we're going to talk about Vietnam today, and the first thing we need to know about Vietnam is that Vietnam was, at the end of World War II, a French colony. The French had kind of colonized this whole part of the world. However, based on battles like the one you see the pictures of here, Dien Bien Phu, and many others like that, the French kind of get their butts kicked by the communists and the not communists in Vietnam. At this point, they're kind of on the same side. They're on the we hate France side. And generally speaking, anybody that's not Vietnamese. As a matter of fact, the communists and the anti-communists didn't really even see a difference between themselves at that point because they were just ticked off at the Europeans. So, France decides after a couple of years of fighting that it's not really worth it. They'd rather just go ahead and leave. And when the French leave, all of a sudden, the communists and the anti-communists figure out that they don't really have that much in common. The communists are going to set up shop in North Vietnam. You can see here on our map that it's very close to China. That's convenient if you're a communist, easy to get supplies and other things like that. They are led by a man named Ho Chi Minh. And then the anti-communists on the other side, led by a bunch of guys. This is one of the military generals. His last name was Diem. A lot of chaos on the not communist side. And just like we learned in Korea, just because you're not a communist doesn't mean that you're cool with the whole freedom thing. These guys were totalitarians themselves, just not communist totalitarian dictators. Not nice guys. Some of them assassinated each other to kind of take over. The Americans kind of helped sometimes when they didn't like the guy that was in charge. It's a mess. But anyway, just should be feeling a little bit familiar here. The Chinese decide to support the communists in North Vietnam, and the Americans decide to support the South Vietnamese. Oh, the memories. It feels like just yesterday. Oh, wait, it was. Well, maybe not in world history, but in our presentation series, it definitely was. This is just like Korea. So, the Americans decide that they're going to do things a little bit differently this time. We are going to be defensive, which means that we're going to basically start the war hoping to only have half. And so the Americans kind of set up their rules for engagement, and their rules for engagement are we are here to defend the South Vietnamese. That might stop this from being a mess. We are definitely not really, but kind of sort of fighting the North Vietnamese, but only when they try to come into our side. And if that feels confusing, we've got 2 more arrows coming at you. We are definitely not fighting the Laos people. You can see here that Vietnam is a very long, thin country, which is kind of an interesting situation because when your enemies decide to walk through somebody else's country that you're not fighting, makes it really hard to drop bombs on them. We are also not fighting the Chinese people. And so we're in this tricky situation again where we're not really going to drop bombs on our enemies. As a matter of fact, the Americans are almost only going to drop bombs on their allies. And if that doesn't make sense to you, it didn't make sense to me and a lot of other people, but that was the strategy. So, the North Vietnamese would just kind of go on a hiking trip. They called it the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they would walk through Laos and Cambodia, which were 2 other countries that were right next to Vietnam. And that way they knew that they were pretty much safe because the Americans wouldn't go over there because we didn't have any beef with the Laotins or the Cambodians. And so as long as they kind of walked along, they could show up like way behind your line. So it wasn't as simple as just kind of having a little demilitarized zone up there at the top and just kind of holding serve. You had a much trickier situation. To make things even worse, there were a lot of communists in the South. They called themselves the Viet Cong. They were guerrilla fighters, or terrorists is another way to look at them. They would just kind of run around the countryside in South Vietnam, pop up every once in a while and blow stuff up and then leave. And it made it very difficult for the Americans who didn't know the language or the culture or the practices or anything else like that to really even identify the good guys from the bad guys. And as a matter of fact, we killed the good guys a lot as well. Vietnam was a jungle war. It was a mess, and because the Americans were mainly on the defensive, basically their strategy, and I'm not making this up, was to send people in platoons. You can see a picture of one here on the right-hand side. You'd have a platoon of guys, and they would basically walk through the jungle waiting to get ambushed by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese. In other words, they were walking into traps on purpose just to try to find somebody to fight. That's kind of what you have to do when you're kind of sort of fighting somebody, but really kind of fighting a defensive war. We also, in the bottom left-hand corner here, decided that we were going to drop a lot of defoliant called Agent Orange all over the country. Now, of course, we didn't drop it on North Vietnam. We're not fighting there, so we dropped it on our allies. Defoliants kill plants, which means that we made farming really difficult, which caused food problems for our allies. Not only that, but in the top middle here, you see a picture of napalm. We dropped lots of that too, all over our allies, which really made them love us all that much more. The last defining feature of the Vietnam War is the helicopters that you see on the bottom right there. It's sometimes called the Helicopter War because helicopters played a big role in getting people from one point to another. You're talking about pretty small groups of fighting people. It was a lot easier to fly them there in a helicopter than it was to walk through the jungle. The problem being, of course, once you get there, you're kind of stuck if you get attacked by people who have more people or firepower than what you do. Vietnam's not a good situation, and pretty soon in America, you start to have a pretty strong movement. It's attached to the hippies, although we can't just connect it to the hippies. Basically saying that America needs to get out of Vietnam, that this isn't really our fight, that we just need to kind of let things alone. Nobody really cares, even if they become communists. We need to let them kind of clean up this mess on their own. 58,000 soldiers dying has a lot to do with that as well. So the Americans basically tell everybody 5 years before they officially leave for good that they're quitting. Not really a good way to win a war. You just kind of tell people, hey, even though we might seem like we're beating you on the battlefields now, we're done. We're just going to quit playing really hard, and if you just wait us out, we'll get out of your way. And that's pretty much what happens. 1975, the last Americans leave Saigon. That's the former capital of South Vietnam. And pretty much right after the Americans leave, the South Vietnamese, who are really, really tired of fighting, especially because, if you remember, I talked about their dictators. They're not nice guys anyway. So why would you bother fighting for a dictatorship that didn't really treat you well to begin with and was allies with these Americans that dumped all of these bombs and napalm and Agent Orange on your country? They figure, hey, communism maybe is as cool as it's going to get, so let's go with that. And then Vietnam actually becomes communist, and there's lots of stories of people who got out or unfortunately didn't get out for a long time. And it does kind of go from bad to worse. Vietnam turns into a communist dictatorship. The hardships continue and even get worse. Many of the South Vietnamese are punished by the communist government for fighting against communism. And they try to get out if they can. The Vietnam War, it can be considered in some ways the only war that America has actually lost. It's not a technical war. Congress never declared it to be a war. It's an armed conflict. But when 58,000 of your soldiers don't come home and millions more come home messed up from having to fight inside of a jungle where they are literally fighting for their lives, whether you call it an armed conflict or a war, feels like a war to those people. So, Vietnam, kind of a containment fail, and the war that America lost.